The Knotts of South Africa, an 1820 settler family. I've been able to trace our Knott family history as far back as 1752, when Sampson Knott was born. He lived till 1801. Sampson was born in Sandwich, Kent, on the 9th of August, 1752. Sampson married Susanna Joad in 1780. He was a miller in Ramsgate, Kent, which is very near Sandwich, as you will see on the map. Now Sampson died in 1801, and he left 2 properties on the South Cliff near Ramsgate to his wife. That's where the mill was, on one of those properties. Sampson's mill burnt down 5 years later after he had died, in 1806, and they had to find other employment. That's his sons. Kemp, his son, then tried oyster farming on the north coast of Kent at Whitstable and Sea Salter, circled in the green ring. But he didn't make a go of that, so he moved to London. And as we said, Sampson Knott married Susanna Joad. They had 3 children that we know of, but we're interested in Kemp because that is our settler ancestor. Kemp Knott married Anne Walker, and they had 10 children altogether, but we're interested in George because that is our line. Now Sampson and Susanna had 3 children that we know of. There may have been more, but the one we're interested in is Kemp. Kemp was born in 1783 and he died in 1857. He married Anne Walker of London. Now Kemp and Anne had 10 children altogether. 2 died in infancy soon after they arrived in South Africa in about 1823 and 1825. They must have died very young because they didn't even have names. The older children all survived except for John, who died at about 22, and Susanna was also about that age. She died in her early 20s. Now the line of Knotts that I'm from are Kemp and Anne's son George. Kemp and Anne were married on the 19th of February 1814 in the church of St. Martin's in the Fields, what is today Trafalgar Square in London. I've been very privileged to go into that church. It's absolutely stunning. In 1819, Kemp, who was 36, and Anne was only 29, and their 18-month-old son George, that is now George the First, decided to emigrate to South Africa. George was born on the 17th of April, 1818. They were part of the first 1820 settlers to set foot in South Africa because they were on the Chapman and they were part of Bailey's party. This is a replica of the Chapman. It might look huge, but they were actually quite small and they bobbed around a lot on the sea. And there was a lot of seasickness in that 4-month journey from London down to Cape Town. And in the left-hand corner is John Bailey, a very strict leader of the party and a very young guy. This is just a rough map of the route that these old sailing ships would have taken to maximize the use of the winds at various times of the year. And bottom right photo shows the cramped conditions in which they sailed for 4 whole months. You can just imagine all the shenanigans that took place on those ships, even though there were very strict rules, and you can imagine the fighting and all that. You just have to read the diary of Sophia Piggott to see what went on in those ships and the bad behavior. But the crew were extremely strict, and the captain would chuck you off the ship if he thought you were bad enough. Now this has been a mystery for many, many years, but it has finally been solved. Kemp Knott came out under the alias of Harrison. He used the name William Harrison, but Anne and their toddler George used their Christian names. It is presumed that the Knotts took the place of a family named Harrison, who changed their minds at the last minute. The Thames was frozen over for weeks, so it delayed the journey of all the ships by at least 3 or 4 weeks. They had to wait until the ice had melted. And we think that the family Harrison had changed their minds because a lot of those families had to wait on the ship for those 3 weeks while the ice was frozen because they'd packed everything on board already. Well, how can we prove that William Harrison was Kemp Knott? There are several reasons. The inexplicable disappearance of William Harrison from the records of the Bailey Party in 1821. The equally inexplicable appearance of Kemp Knott in the records of the same party in 1822. Both Harrison and Knott describe themselves as millers. The coincidence in the names of their wives and the names of and ages of their children. Mary was born at sea, but we will talk about that later. So on the 3rd of December 1819, Kemp Anne and their son George, aged 19 months, sailed from London on the Chapman. Anne was 6 months pregnant at the time, and she gave birth to a daughter, Mary, on the 29th of February 1820, when they were 76 days outbound from London and 17 days from Table Bay. Apparently Anne's father was dead against her getting on that ship. He was really very, very upset because she was 6 months pregnant. And they knew the journey was 4 months. And he knew that that baby would be born on the ship. The Chapman arrived on the 17th of March, 1820 in Table Bay. And then it arrived on the 10th of April, 1820. In Algoa Bay. This is a famous painting of them disembarking. That boat in the middle is called a long boat, and the smaller boats were to keep it steady. You can see how overcrowded they were, but I'm sure they had to wait till low tide. This is just a painting of Canvas Town. You can see the white tents on the left, and the cooking and all the people chatting, and the ships waiting in the bay. Just as an aside, each settler family was supposed to pay for their goods being transported by Boer ox wagon, but that was later dropped when they found that the settlers were in such a bad financial state on the tiny little pockets of land that they were each given. Now, number 8 is the location of the Bailey Party. They were the first party to arrive on the shores of Algoa Bay. And they were the first party to arrive. You can see they were placed there. Number 8 is that long location there. You can see they were placed strategically there to be a buffer between the Xhosas and the Boers, who were slightly more away from the Fish River. And I managed to find a map of Kemp Knott's location. Just look at this map. On the left, it's got their Brack Stream running along the left. In the middle it says good grazing ground, and that little dot there near the bottom left I think must be a house, and it also says a small spring, and you'll see pools. Now his neighbours were Thomas Stringfellow in the north, or rather in the west, Joseph Goodies on the eastern side, James Hoole on the western side, and John Chase next door to him. And you can see there's a road that goes right through the middle of his location. Now, I went with Colby Cockcroft, who's Dave Cockcroft's son. He's very, very interested in family history. And we actually found this plot of land. It belongs to a local farmer. You can see where I've tried to draw it on Google Maps. There is a small little Brack Stream there, but it's been affected by the R72 that goes right slap bang through the middle of the plot. We found the actual road. You can see it was a road long ago, that blue line. And we also found the spring. Well done to Colby with his sharp eyes. It was quite overgrown. Now this plot, you'll see on the right-hand side of this plot is the road to the Fish River Lighthouse. And then you can see that quarry and the road to Shaw Park. I was very impressed with Colby for finding this spring. It was very overgrown. And it was quite a surreal experience to actually go and stand there and to think that Kemp Knott built that. It wasn't running, it had no water at the time because it was just after the drought. And this is what looks like the road that goes right past the spring. It must have been bigger long ago for ox wagons, but you can definitely see it used to be a thoroughfare. And remember the good grazing ground in that map? That is it there, just beyond the bush. This local farmer's got cattle there, so Kemp Knott also had cattle. But times were tough. Kemp's house burned down a year later, in 1821, and he lost everything, including a parcel of very valuable goods that were sent out to him by miller friends from London. As if that wasn't bad enough, a summons of debt was issued against Kemp in 1821 by John Bailey. Kemp then went to Grahamstown in 1823 to work at a mill, but while he was away, 75 of his cattle were stolen from his farm, and he returned to his farm the following year in 1824. And while he was in Grahamstown, he bought lot number 19 in Artificers Square in 1824. In this map you can see where I have found it. If you know where 10 Cross Shop is, it's in Cross Street. This is across the road from there and 2 plots away. I don't think he actually built the house that is currently on that plot. And that is the house that I found on Google Maps. It's a beautiful house, but I'm sure he didn't build it. There's no indication of when he sold that plot. Now, Kemp found it difficult to support his family of 7 children on a small bit of land, so he tried other ways to supplement his income, like fishing and oyster farming. Remember, he had done that at Sea Salter and Whitstable on the North Kent coast. But he said that the sea was very rough there off Kleinamont, and his health wasn't very good because he had to stand so deep in the ice-cold water. So I don't think he did that for very long. Then after the 6th Frontier War, Kemp set up a trading post near the mouth of the Kei River. He paid local chiefs £8 in tax per annum. Now this was illegal for the time. The settlers were not allowed to trade with the Xhosas at all, but he pleaded ignorance when he was found out, and he told them he got on very well with the Xhosas. There was no animosity at all, and that he had 7 children to support, and he got off scot-free. Kemp even spent some time at the clay pits, which is in the Coombs Valley. That is where they mined the red ochre that the Xhosas used to use for rubbing all over their bodies. And this is a photo of the clay pits that they mined clay from. The Xhosas used to come there for centuries before the settlers came, and then when the settlers established those farms, the Xhosa were allowed to mine clay at certain times. In 1844, Kemp was in serious financial debt, and he ended up serving 9 months in jail in Grahamstown. His farm was sold to pay his debts. And my mother always said, how on earth can he pay his debts if he's sitting in jail? And so many people have said that as well. Kemp and his family then moved to Tarker's Post, which is in the Tarkestad district, where they set up a trading station. Then Kemp and Anne only spent 3 years at Tarker's Post, and in 1847 they moved back to Grahamstown. Then in 1850 they were living with their son George at Botha's Post. So you can see Kemp and Anne moved around a lot. Now, George and his brother John were transport riders, and They used to transport goods by ox wagon, and they made quite a bit of money, I think. And they were able to buy 2 plots in Market Street, off Market and Donkin Street here in Grahamstown. And their plots were joined, and I think they're still joined, and there was an old cottage on the plot. Today there's a very big house on that plot. And I found the house on Google Maps. So in 1852 they were living in Donkin Street, Grahamstown. Now Kemp died on the 1st of May, 1857. He was 74 years old, and he is buried in the Baptist section of the old cemetery in Grahamstown. These are photos I took when I went there a few years ago, and I was very excited to actually find this grave. It was still intact. Kemp is buried with his daughter Susanna, who was in her 20s when she died. Now the inscription on the headstone says, "Sacred to the memory of Kemp Knott, who departed this life on the 1st day of May, 1857, aged 74 years. The deceased was a son of Sampson and Susanna Knott of Ramsgate, England, and came to this country with the British settlers of 1820. Also, Susanna, daughter of the above, who died on the 10th of July, 1850, aged 22 years. So Susanna died 7 years before her father. Now we move on to George Knott the First. As we said, he came out as a 19-month-old toddler. He was born in 1818 in London, and he died in 1891. In 1835, George was 17, and he accompanied his father in trading. I think that was probably to Kemp at first and then to Tarker's Post later. In 1844, George and his brother John were transport riders, and they bought plots numbers 133 and 134 in Donkin Street, Grahamstown. George bought Wooders Post and Breder Drift farms in the Fort Beaufort district with the money he made from transport riding. George, when he was 32, he married Rhoda Ralph, 26, of Alice. In April 1871, George and Rhoda and 4 sons went to the Kimberley diamond fields to mine for diamonds. The 3 daughters and youngest son stayed with relatives. By February 1872, they had found 60 diamonds, including a large 25-carat diamond. And this is a photo I took of the big hole in Kimberley, where they did mining of diamonds. And 2 other spots as well, very close to Kimberley. In May of the same year, they returned to Wooders Post. George bought many farms along the Cat and Great Fish rivers with the money that he made from diamonds. George and Rhoda were staunch Baptists and founder members of the Alice Baptist Congregation, which was established in 1874. George died at Wooders Post in 1891 at the age of 72 years. He left each of his 4 sons 2 farms each. George II got Klipfontein farm, where I grew up. I think he only got the 1 farm at the time, but it was a farm that was comprised of 4 sections. And his 3 daughters got Onverwacht farm, and the balance of the estate was distributed equally between his 7 children. And this is a photo of George Knott. The farms that George Knott I owned at the time of his death. You can see Onverwacht, which the girls got. Klipfontein farm is where I grew up. The Junction, the Tongue farm, and Wooders Post is what George owned before, and Breder Drift. Then he also owned the Cat River Mouth and Craig and Gunnell farms, all along the Cat and the Fish rivers. Then after George I's death, on the 7th of February 1895, the Knott Memorial Church on Klipfontein Farm was opened in a large ceremony attended by many as a memorial to George I. Now these 3 photos I took at the very last church service at this Knott Memorial Church in 1982, before we had to leave. Bottom left photo is Aunt Norma Cowcroft playing the pedal organ, which I think was moved to the Kleinamon Church in the end. Then the right side photo is my mom standing on the left, Malcolm Pulteney to her left, Aunt Muriel Knott, so the middle, Barry Wasdale next to her, and crouching down is Uncle Vin Cowcroft and Phyllis Wasdale. And I think Frank Stocks is there with a black blazer on. Let's recap a bit the family tree. We've spoken about George the First. He had 7 children. And Joseph married Mary Wakeford. That is Sam Knott's line of the family. Mine is George Knott the Second, who married Dorothy Cowcroft. They used to call her Dolly. They had 5 children, and of course the one and only son was called George. So he was George the Third. That is my grandfather. Now I'm going to touch briefly on Mary Knott, who was born on the ship in 1820 and she died in 1898. Mary was born on the 29th of February 1820, that's leap year, on board the Chapman en route from London to Table Bay, when the ship was 17 days from Table Bay. At the age of 19, she married Henry Sparks, a mason and a widower of Albany, in the Union Chapel in Grahamstown. She lived in Grahamstown until 1850, and then she moved to the farm Haddon near Adelaide. In 1871, Henry and Mary joined George and Rhoda in Kimberley to mine for diamonds. Henry died at Kimberley on Sunday the 18th of August, 1872, at the age of 58. I grew up with the story that he was staring into the big hole at Kimberley when someone came up from behind him and pretended to push him in, and he died instantly of a heart attack. Mary brought his body back and she buried him in the Adelaide cemetery. She then carried on farming in the Adelaide district and bought the farm Gateshead with money that she borrowed from the Grahamstown Savings Bank. She farmed successfully for many years until her death on the 4th of June 1898 at the age of 78 years. We're going to talk about George Knott II now, my great-grandfather. George was born at Wooders Post on the 1st of August 1859. He inherited Klipfontein farm from his father. He was 27 when he married Dorothy Cowcroft, that they used to call Dolly, and she was 24 years old, and she was from the next door farm, Kingston. George and Dolly had 4 daughters and 1 son that were all born at Klipfontein. That one son, of course, was also called George, my grandfather. He was George the Third. Now George owned 5 farms: Klipfontein, Craigenagannor, Menzieskop, Fort Wilshire, and Brambledene on the Hog's Back. Aunt Nell and Aunt Ton lived there for a while. And in this picture, from left to right, Auntie Nell, Aunt Ton, and Granny Rose. Looks like they're having a good time there at Brambledene. George died of influenza with complications at Klipfontein Farm on the 6th of March 1919. Apparently he had been swimming in the cold mountain streams up there on the Hog's Back at Brambledene, and he caught a very bad flu, and he died of it. This is the graveyard at Klipfontein. My great-grandfather, George II, is buried there with Dolly. You'll see the grave there on the left. Then in the middle is my grandfather, Georgiana, they called him. He's buried there with his wife, Rose, Granny Rose. Next to their grave on the right is my late brother Michael, who died in a gun accident on our farm in 1977. In the foreground of this picture is Rhoda Ann or Aunt Tony's grave on the left, and on the right is Ellen Amy, Auntie Nell. And I have very fond memories of Auntie Nell, because I boarded with her for about 5 years in junior school while I attended Alice Primary School. George Knott III, he was known as Georgiana. That's my grandfather. I was unfortunate to never ever meet him. He died years before I was born. Georgiana was born on the 7th of May 1889 at Klipfontein Farm. Here he is pictured with his 3 eldest children out of 9. George, who would be George IV, Dumile, Dorothy, and John, my father. My dad inherited Klipfontein Farm after Georgiana's death because George IV, my dad's brother, wanted to farm in Rhodesia. Georgiana married Rose Moorcroft from Klipcrawl Farm in the Queenstown district on the 5th of August 1924. In this photo she's pictured with Michael, my older brother. Georgiana and Rose had 9 children, and in this photo they're standing in order from eldest on the left to youngest on the right. This photo was taken at their mother's funeral in 1978. So from left to right are George IV, known as Dumile, Dorothy, John, Anne, Margaret, Sydney, Mary, William, who was known as Borley, and Rose. Georgiana died of cancer on the 25th of November 1954 at the age of 65 years. The Knotts of Klipfontein. This map shows where Klipfontein Farm is situated. I've put the GPS coordinates on the top right corner. It was south of Alice on the Alice-Peddy Road. George Knott I bought Klipfontein Farm in the Alice district with money that he made at the diamond fields near Kimberley in 1872. After his death in 1892, he left Klipfontein Farm to his son, George II. This is George II and his wife Dorothy Cowcroft, known as Dolly, and their 5 children. When George II died in 1919, he left Klipfontein Farm to his only son, George III, also known as Georgiana. George Knott III's 9 children, standing in order from left to right, oldest to youngest. George IV, known as Dumile, and Dorothy, John, Anne, Margaret, Sydney, Mary, William, known as Borley, and Rose. Some photos of George III's children growing up at Klipfontein. Sid, George, and John. 6 of the Knott children at Klipfontein. George, or Dumile, and John in spanning oxen at Klipfontein. Rose, John, and baby Michael at the back of Klipfontein House. You can see what we used to call the gas shed, where the generator was. John and his older sister Dorothy, or Dot, in front of Klipfontein House. When George III died in 1954, he left Klipfontein Farm to his second son, John, because his eldest son, George IV, wanted to farm in Rhodesia. John Knott with son Andrew. Some photos of Klipfontein House and the outbuildings. Klipfontein House was built in the early 1900s. Klipfontein House was a large house. It had 7 bedrooms and a large kitchen and even a large pantry for an old house that size. It was apparently also the first house in the district to get electricity from a generator, which in those days was called a lighting plant. Klipfontein House in 1982, just before we left it. The outbuildings viewed from the dairy or ironing room. The view from the front veranda from Klipfontein House in 1982, just before we had to leave. We could see the entire Amatola mountain range from there. Klipfontein Dairy and Ironing Room, built in the early 1900s. This had 3 rooms. The one on the left was used for the milk. It stored milk. It was like a cold room, and sometimes honey. This middle room was also a cold storage room with stone floors, and my mom used to cut up meat there in that room. And the room on the right was in later years used as an ironing room, but before that it was used as a school room, where my dad and his siblings went to school, and they were taught by a tutor there. Our happy lives at Klipfontein. John Knott and family in 1982, just before we had to leave Klipfontein. It was bought by the South African government for inclusion into the then Ciskei homeland. From left to right, Nadine, my mom, Andrew, my second brother, myself, Lynette, and my dad, John. Inset in this photo is Michael, my elder brother, who died in a rifle accident on the farm on the 30th of March, 1977. Michael on the front veranda. Beautiful open views all around. Michael with Velile and the stud Hereford bull Gilby in 1976, a year before Michael died. Andrew as a baby with our dad John in front of Klipfontein House. Andrew, home from the army in 1981 with the Doberman Rex. Me at Klipfontein. I was very much an outdoors kid. I was never in the house. I was exploring nature and just enjoying being out in the veld. I grew up on the back of a horse. After we left. My 2008 visit from the cattle grid. We didn't want to go any closer. The only thing left of the house then was a chimney behind the shacks off-center to the left, where the arrow's pointing. My 2018 visit from a light aircraft. Nothing is left of the house. See where the red arrow points. Leaving Klipfontein was one of the most tragic events in our lives. Klipfontein will always be home to me, even though the house no longer exists. Morris Tim Knott, born in 1908 and died in 1978. That was Sam Knott, son of Joseph and Mary Knott, née Wakeford. And this is the family tree, just to recap. Kemp and Anne were the 1820 settlers. They had a son, George the First, who married Rhoda Ralph, and they had several children, and Sam is from Joseph, one of the sons. This is Sam with his parents and siblings. That's him at the back, second from the left, and his parents to the right of him. Sam was engaged for 21 years to Emily Shapiro, but his mother prevented them from getting married because she was Jewish. After that, he never married. When his father died, Sam and his brother Bull, who was Llewellyn Joseph, became business partners in speculating in the buying and selling of cattle. They used the profits that they made from cattle to buy farms. In his heyday, Sam owned about 62 farms and 30,000 cattle, mainly in the Alice, Peddy, Grahamstown and Fort Beaufort districts. He was flown to stock sales in a light aircraft. While living at Llangollen, south of Alice, Sam served on the Fort Beaufort as well as the Alice divisional councils for 40 years. He would readily donate money to the councils if needed, and he was fluent in English, Afrikaans, and isiXhosa. In the 1980s, Sam was forced to sell all the Peddy and Alice farms for incorporation into the Ciskei. Sam died in Grahamstown on the 2nd of May, 1987, at the age of 78 years, and he is buried at Boerders Post. This is a photo I took after his burial that day. At the time of his death, he owned 13 farms on his own and half shares in another 6 farms with his niece, Colleen Pulteney. 11 of the farms went to establishing the Sam Knott Kudu Reserve, which is now part of the Great Fish River Reserve. What I find interesting is that Sam bought back many of the farms that his ancestor George Knott I had bought originally, with diamond money. The balance of his estate went to the children of his late sister, Phyllis Bristow. It has been said that his estate was valued at just over 7 million rand, but if you count the farms that he donated to the Kudu Reserve, it would be more like 12 to 15 million rand, and that was a lot in the 1980s. Sam never married, but in later years he found love and happiness with Rena Wallace, whose farm he bought. He and Rena ended up living on that farm for years.